here to talk about a new event that IHE has been sponsoring now. We kicked the tires of it in 17. We're now put a lot of new structure to it in 2018 called the Plug-a-thon. A number of you here are probably familiar with the Connect-a-thon that IHE has been running like forever. This is a new kind of event that we have been doing now this year, and we will do it again in Europe. And you'll hear more about that as we go forward. But this year's opportunity is to look at new tech and kind of dispel, as the title says, the hype about the new tech and some value that we have. And so I'll introduce the co-presenters in a minute, but let me just talk a little bit about the Plug-a-thon event itself. Okay, so this is who we are. So I'm John. Okay, then Samir here is to my far left, and John Novak here is here to my immediate left. So, and they're going to be the main spokespeople here for today's session, because these are two individuals from two organizations that actually stepped in and sponsored the Plug-a-thon event for IHE USA this year. So what's a Plug-a-thon? Okay, and how is it different from a Connect-a-thon? It's really an event which starts off with a thought and a general idea around a new tech, but it's really a hybrid kind of conference. It's a mix of education and then some discussion, in the forum. Then you get into some coding and connecting, depends on where they are in that technology. And then you talk about it, you evaluate it, and you maybe do another session. So there are 2-day sessions that run alongside the Connect-a-thon venue. So of course we did it in January this year in Cleveland. And the objective of this is to not start with kind of a tailored, structured deliverable, but let the participants and the sponsors drive the content, drive the use cases, drive the challenges, and make that, and you build the agenda in the months prior to the event, right? So you register, and then you come in, and then you start to build the agenda around the interest level of your organization, right? What we found at the Plug-a-thon is that although we will break it out into tracks, and you'll hear about that in a second, the interest across the tracks, the new technology stakeholders of track A are equally interested in the track B stuff, because that's part of the challenge, is where are the touch points? I've got new things coming at me, but I'm not in a silo world. I'm delivering something that's an integration across the entire ecosystem. One of the other secondary outcomes, and I'll call it secondary because it isn't the primary reason why we did this, is that we are intending and hoping to feed the pipeline of the standards development organization. Now, I'm assuming most of you by now, by this part of the week, know what IHE is, right? And you're here witnessing scenarios that are largely grounded in IHE profiles for interoperability. However, IHE as an organization needs and wants input on what's next. So the Connect-a-thon is a representation of the profiles that have been developed and have gotten some maturity over the years and are in trial implementation. The Plug-a-thon is intended to feed the pipeline, to feed the conversation of new technology and things that are on the horizon. So we did 4 tracks for the Plug-a-thon this year. You can see them at the bottom, right? So we did an mHealth track, so everybody knows and kind of has their own interpretation of mHealth. But for us, and you'll see a section on in a minute about what we interpreted those tracks to be. But we saw 4 tracks of interest from different stakeholder pool that we wanted to talk about in the Plug-a-thon. So the mHealth track is about the new app world. right? So we've got a lot of legacy HIT vendors here, represented here, and on the show floor and the exhibit hall, et cetera. But we've got a lot of innovative startup companies, too, that are in the app space. They're writing code for the smartphones of various flavors. They're putting services in the cloud. You know, this is the mHealth world that we now have to deal with. We have another track that we call Devices on Fire. Now, this one, in terms of a Plug-a-thon track, was probably the most mature. The device connectivity has been there for quite some time. However, it doesn't use Fire. It uses the V2, the HL7 V2 transaction set. So the Devices on Fire is about a transition of existing transactions and interoperability of devices to EHR systems, and we Fireize them, and that's that track. The other two that we looked at was the Internet of Things track. And you know, that for us in medicine means sensors, wearables, etc., that are going to now stream data, bits of data, not documents of data, and that's going to now need to be baked into the repository of health information on a patient, right? So that's a whole new approach than what we've seen up to now. And last but not least, we got the new kid on the block, the blockchain track, right? So we're not quite sure where that's going to fit. So of the four tracks, this is probably was the most newest topic of discussion, and as one might guess, garnered the most interest from the participants and the sponsors because, hey, what is this? You know, how do we fit this into our legacy HIT? How do we fit this together with the other tracks that are there, right? Just a quick high-level view of what we saw as observations and results, right? So the first thing we said, this is really something we can call the first pillar of a testing continuum. Now, we understand the Connect-a-thon is clearly one of those other legs of the testing continuum, and some of you might be familiar with a recent introduction of a new tier of testing called conformity assessment from IHE. So on that end of the spectrum, you have conformity assessment, very much like the O&C's testing and certification program. In the middle, you have the Connect-a-thon, and on the far left of that continuum, you have the Plug-a-thon. So that's how we're seeing this now going forward, that we have these three approaches to testing, HIT testing. As I mentioned, blockchain, the new kid on the block, took a lot of interest, not only from the Plug-a-thon participants, but from the Connect-a-thon participants. They were all interested to know about it, which was great. I think there was a session that had like around 50 people in it just to talk about this topic, and we brought some SMEs in, so it's an education as well as a coding attempt, right? Internet of Things and mHealth, this was kind of a new development. What we found is that arena of HIT vendors are going after the same ambulatory home-based care delivery model. So what we found is that the IoT track people, in some cases, the first hop for them was the mHealth people. You know, there was apps that were going to work with the sensor data and work that out. So going forward, we're thinking that the IoT and mHealth really can be merged. You can look at that, and that's what we saw in this year's Plug-a-thon. And so that's not a surprise, or a little bit of a surprise for us, but that's kind of how it presented itself this year. Not surprising was person identity management and administration still out there as a challenge. What we did was we layered in some new sources and ways to capture data. We still didn't solve the problem with the old stuff, right? So besides EHRs and HIEs figuring out how to handle person identity management, we've now got sensors, we now got apps, we've got cloud services, we've got all these things. They're all facing the same problem. So that's still a problem and a use case we need to solve, okay? An interesting new term came out of our conversation, and we're calling it the new economy, right? And the new economy is saying, we have now a paradigm of care delivery which is going to redefine the patient-provider-payer relationship and the interaction between those three components of our healthcare ecosystem. And so this is a term that came up in the conversation. We'll see if it survives and what we can define with that. But it's something that I think was a good takeaway for the participants. Okay, so with that, I'm going to hand the baton off here first to John Novak from the NJII, who brings to the table a perspective. The interesting thing about our two sponsors is that they come at from two totally different perspectives. They touch each other, but their interests and their participation both inbound to the Plug-a-thon in terms of the sessions and the contributions they made there and their takeaways could be quite different. So at that, John?
Thank you, John. So as John had mentioned, I'm John Novak. I'm the Senior Director of Government Technologies and Architecture for the New Jersey Innovation Institute. The New Jersey Innovation Institute, we are part of the New Jersey Institute of Technology, the state's technology university. We are also the state designated for health IT interoperability. We are the managers of the New Jersey Health Information Network, which is actually owned by the State Department of Health, and we actually manage it for them. We are also a CMS certified registry for over 300 measures. So that's kind of where we're coming from it. Some of our background is we actually started as one of the original high-tech grantees. So we started helping providers move from paper-based to electronic medical records, and we saw the national progression from there. We moved into health information exchange, supporting an inner-city health information exchange called HealthyC, which was designed to help the urban hospitals within our city that could not afford a full-blown, full-feature HIE, something that was affordable that they could leverage. Then we started getting into measures, whether it's DISRIP, and you can kind of see the progression, moving from the measures and then becoming a transformation network grantee and awardee, trying to help 11,000 providers move from fee-for-service to value-based care. All of those things all are about collecting data, moving data, interoperability. So a lot of what we've done over the last 10 years is trying to move that needle forward because it's a challenge. It's everything from chasing paper charts to data extracts and integration. So when John asked us to participate, we thought it would be a great opportunity to start talking about people. New Jersey's ecosystem is very diverse, not unlike many other ones in the nation. We have over 70 hospitals, 1,400 plus primary care providers, and about the same number of specialists. We have 6 recognized HIEs that didn't talk to each other. They were all silos, couldn't exchange data. And we also had 5 large health systems that didn't participate in HIEs widespread. They each had little pockets in their organizations. New Jersey also is unique in the nation as we have the most 1 to 2 provider practices in the nation, which is a challenge. Small docs don't have the money to invest in the interoperability and moving the data around, so they're getting penalized under all their payer programs and everything like that. So we really want to make a change in that. So that kind of led us to the value of the Plug-a-thon from us is allowing us to present some of the use cases that we've been working on and talk about how do we move them forwards. Transitions of care. How do you take a patient when they're transitioning out of a hospital and make sure they get that follow-up visit, they get the med rec. Without that data, a lot of our providers don't even know their patient was seen in a hospital. Or if you're taking one of your patients and referring them to a specialist, how do you get that information without giving them paper charts or a CD? We want to move that needle. Quality reporting, as I mentioned, this is everything from pulling paper charts to doing data extracts, and it really should be automated. We've been doing this for 10 years now under meaningful use, and there's still a lot of manual piece, and that really has to change. Public health reporting. We started with immunizations. Our immunization department is overwhelmed. It's a very small department, and they're trying to get providers onboarded to them. A year ago, they had about 1,200 providers that had signed up that were in the queue to be implemented. We need to make that go much quicker. So how do we increase that interoperability when they're using legacy systems? They're not up to date with their EMR, so we need to move them. Smart alerting, there's all types of things that we can do with smart alerting. Opioids, a perfect example everyone talks about. It's a crisis. If you can, at point of care, put back a risk factor that someone is based on their demographics or past history, an opioid risk. We're not saying that they have an opioid issue, but based on a risk factor, return an alert. Or if someone is seen at an emergency department, be able to flag that they have an advanced directive or a pulse. Those are the type of things that we want to get moving that don't really exist readily available today. Those are just very small examples. And of course, at the bottom, as John mentioned, patient identity, needs to be done to do all these things. If you can't uniquely and identify that person, you can't do anything. Okay. As John had mentioned, the Plug-a-thon was talking about open APIs and apps and all this type of stuff. You know, everyone has a smartphone. You can pull up your banking records, your purchase history. It's all there, but you can't do that with your healthcare. You know, why not? It's same technology could be leveraged, and there's tons of APIs and open APIs out there. The other piece is we have standards, right? We have HL7, we have IHE, we have LOINC, SNOMED, ICD 9, 10, RX norm. There's standards out there in normalization that isn't used consistently. How do we move that forward to make sure people are not only coding properly, but in the right place in their EMR, so that data is now in a discrete field, not in notes that you can't extract very easily? As John kind of talked through these, I'm going to just kind of go and give my little flair on them. mHealth, we do believe that patient data is going to be important when you start talking about closing gaps and compliance to their medications and everything else. So we definitely believe that. Devices on fire. Actually, in my slide, I actually struck out the devices. I think it should just be about fire. That interoperability, that API, and whether it's a device, whether it's an API into an application, it's about using the right tool. The Internet of Things, to me, kind of also goes in that mobile health. How do you make those wearables, those point-of-care devices that seamlessly integrate into the EMRs or the provider practice? Blockchain, we think blockchain is, as the new kid on the block, has potential, but it is not a silver bullet for anything, and is not going to be widely adopted this year. But it's definitely something that you want to start looking at, and we want to start to bring into the conversations. How can this chain of trust be leveraged to help us build the foundation of the healthcare for the next 20 years? Right. So one of the things that we brought to the Plug-a-thon ourselves was we have a couple of tools that we love to use, and we thought they would be perfect for someone who's trying to start to poke holes in things and do testing. The first is we have a fire pit. It is a test tool. So basically all it is a fire server that is stood up, readily available, that you can run queries against in real time. Even better, behind that is we have our patient gen, which is synthetic patient data. We have about 5,000 patients that have a full longitudinal record with appropriate comorbidities. Some of them get better, some of them get worse, some of them even die or have kids. So we've developed that, which really makes it great because it's real data that can be used for testing, for demonstrations, and reporting. That's not real. So there's no HIPAA violations, there's no concerns about that. And it does look like a real person, down to the history. They even have photos, addresses, and all that type of stuff. So it really is a good tool that can be leveraged. Okay. So at the Plug-a-thon itself, we had those four different silos that John had talked about. And as we all sat around the table, it all fell apart. We all kind of started combining, well, we can't just talk about one of those things. It's got to be everything. And the mobile health, the device on fire, and everything, blockchain, the groups were originally in 4 different corners. We ended up all just talking across each other and really all just kind of melded and talked about what's really possible with it, which is really important for us. It's because, again, as I'm talking about, this is all for us, enabling our use cases and moving forward that interoperability piece. Is with these small practice providers, in order to attain meaningful use, submit their immunizations, get the smart alerts, to effectively do transition to care, the same old is not going to do it. We've been, as I said, 10 years, and we really haven't moved the needle. These technologies and this type of activity of a small group getting together and biting off little pieces that can then grow and become something that's actually full-fledged in a connect-a-thon is really impressive, and that's really what our value is. Start small, have some of the ideas, and then hope that those ideas are picked up and they can be ran to the finish line. And it's about helping the providers move from that fee-for-service to the value-based care. So this is just, again, another diagram of the whole New Jersey connectivity on as the Health Information Network. We're trying to connect all those hospitals, those providers, these HIEs together, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel. Do it once, do it right. Standardizing your ADT messages across the state, making a single access port into the state registries on what we call the state node. So whether you're getting to Department of Health or the Medicaid services, it's one connection. Be able to do a record locator service for the state so that each of our HIEs and large healthcare systems don't have to onboard to Care Equality, Commonwealth, Sequoia on their own. They have someone that can help them walk that path and get them there. So really, and that's what it is we believe that the Connect-a-thon is really fundamental. This type of stuff with a Plug-a-thon, Connect-a-thon to allow us to move forward the needle using our existing tools. There's a lot of wheels out there. We don't need more wheels. We just got to use the ones we have. So our intent is to kind of use the Plug-a-thon and the Connect-a-thon to help us move forward and enable these services statewide. We have a lot of this in production, and it's about getting people on board. So you have those providers that need those little pieces of technologies. We don't want providers having to go spend $10,000 to $15,000 every time they need an interface to connect to a system. We want to use the technology to make it much more plug and play for them, seamless, much more cost effective. So that was really for us the value of participating in the Connect-a-thon and the Plug-a-thon specifically. We look forward to doing it again also. And on that, I will hand it over to Samir.
Great. Thank you, John.
Pleasure.
Great.
Thank you.
All right. So my name is Samir Jain. I'm the Vice President of Technology for Ready Computing. And today I'll talk a little bit about Ready Computing in general, but really why we wanted to sponsor a couple of the tracks that we did at Plug-a-thon and some of the value that we derived. And I'll give you a quick overview of one of the presentations that we actually gave during the Plug-a-thon. So a quick word about Ready Computing. We are mostly a services company, about 75 people, just north of that now. And we've got kind of a funny story because we were founded pretty much right here at the Interoperability Showcase and at Connect-a-thon. A lot of the folks that work for us came from the interoperability world. And so what we really try to do is give back to the community with our sponsorship of events like the Plug-a-thon. We also participate in a lot of the standards creation organizations and the interoperability organizations. So we have authorship of profiles within the IHE community. And we find that to be a very big strategic advantage for us as an organization because it allows us to take our, what we're seeing in the market with our customers and bring that back into the standards, but then it also allows us to figure out where the standards are going and help drive the customer's vision based on those standards as well. Why did we choose to sponsor, these particular tracks within Plug-a-thon? So we sponsored two, mHealth and blockchain. And for mHealth, we really went in as believers. I mean, we do mHealth today. That's a core part of our business. We're developing mobile apps. We're developing, cloud-native applications. And so we wanted to leverage our knowledge to be able to try to bring some real-world experience into the stuff that people were creating at Plug-a-thon. Blockchain, however, we actually went in as skeptics. So I sort of felt that blockchain is maybe a technology that's looking for a solution, or it's a solution that's looking for a problem, I should say. And we wanted to figure out, okay, what are people doing with blockchain within healthcare? What's out there? And so our intent was to deliver a quick presentation on what we're finding in the marketplace with blockchain, which frankly wasn't all that much yet. But we came upon this ONC blockchain challenge, and so we decided that what we would do is summarize the results of this ONC blockchain challenge to kind of foster some of the conversations at Plug-a-thon, around blockchain specifically. And what we found was a lot of people were in the same boat as we were. They were excited about the technology. Maybe they were investing in Bitcoin or Ethereum, but they didn't really know how to fully apply it to healthcare. So we wanted that to be the start of the conversation, really. So a bit about the ONC Blockchain Challenge. It was a challenge that was issued in July of 2016. I apologize for the typo here, but they were taking white paper submissions in a couple of key areas, and what ONC wanted to do is exactly what we wanted to do. They wanted to understand, how blockchain can be applied within healthcare, So they were looking at specifically papers that had to do with crypto and advancing interoperability needs, research, precision medicine, that sort of stuff that's kind of within the subdomains of healthcare. And ultimately, they wanted to just look at things that evolve the objectives of the ONC. And so the participants that participated in the challenge were either teams of individuals or just individuals themselves, usually representative of their companies. And they collected white papers, which were typically about 10 pages in length. They received quite a lot of submissions, over 70 submissions, and had 15 winners. And so the winner selection was really based on, A, how innovative was this idea and how applicable is it to healthcare and the potential for it to really transform the way that we deliver healthcare. And then also, of course, how well it aligns with the objectives of the ONC, which is to really advance interoperability within this country. So the way that we went about this challenge was we kind of divided up the papers. There were 15 that we looked at, the 15 winners, and we tried to categorize or fill out certain categories for each paper. So obviously the author, kind of what's the viewpoint that they're coming into this paper with, the problem domain that they're trying to solve, and what the solution is, of course. And those are kind of the objective measures, as well as target industry, where do they want to solve it within healthcare. Everything was within healthcare, but we had quite a spread of the specific problems within healthcare. Who's participating in the blockchain? And then some of the technical things, like what's the content stored? Why do people want to participate? What's the reward for participation? And then the final category was actually something that I really enjoyed looking at, which was other notable findings, the kind of what's the interesting thing about this particular paper. And that was a very objective measurement that we looked at. So I'll talk about two of the papers that we analyzed today. And the reason why I'm selecting these is I just personally found these papers to be extremely interesting. And the first one is from Kyle at Humana. And so Humana is a payer, obviously, so Kyle was coming in from the payer perspective. And what we're finding in the market is payers are more and more very interested in clinical data and getting access to clinical data. And so I found this paper to be very interesting because what Kyle says is that if you look at the agreements between providers and payers, they're extremely complex. The payment agreements and the various terms that are coded within them. And what ends up happening is it costs the providers about almost 4 hours per week just negotiating and implementing these agreements with all the various payers that they have to work with. And what that ends up being on an aggregated level is $254 billion in sunk costs across the country. So what Kyle's assertion was can we maybe use blockchain to implement smart contracts where these agreements are implemented as smart contracts and the adjudication of the results is done via these smart contracts on the chain. And so the target industry would be obviously the payer market, but the participants would be the payers, providers, and government regulators as well. And I'll get into that in just a second. But talking about the content, the physical content that's actually stored on the chain, you start off with the smart contract, right? And that is the set of rules that defines when this provider is going to get paid and when this provider is not. And so if you can automate that process, the adjudication process for some of the simpler claims out there, what you can potentially do is store the result of that adjudicated claim on the chain itself, and government regulators can actually come in and look at the result of that adjudicated claim process and verify that the payers are meeting their end of the contract and the providers are meeting their end of the contract. So you get audit capabilities inherent to this technology. I thought that was a very interesting use of blockchain and why it makes sense to put this on blockchain. And so the reward for participation here would be the payers are having their adjudication costs reduced significantly. Right now claims take anywhere between 15 to 90 days to process, and sometimes it's a manual process, but ultimately 90% or 80% of these claims can be done automatically. They just have a massive amount of data to go through. All right, so if we distribute it, we distribute the computing power, you can potentially do some cool stuff with it. The next paper that I wanted to talk about was a case study for an application called MedRec. And this was actually put together by Beth Israel in conjunction with MIT. And essentially, they touched on themes that we found to be very common throughout all of the papers, which were distributed consent models and distributed record locator service on the chain. And a lot of people said that this could be a very good use of the technology. So the gist for MedRec is that it's an application that uses blockchain to store the patient-provider relationships, the PPRs, and using, building out a history of consumer interactions with providers allows us to then start building out the care team for a particular patient and start building out a vision of the medical history for a patient. Target industry, of course, care organizations, payers, providers, and researchers. And the researcher concept was interesting. Diving into some of the technical details a tiny bit, the registration contract would be, how the MRN to Ethereum mapping actually works, but then you've got the patient-provider contract. That's the visit information. And there's one thing that's very important is there's no actual medical data that's stored on the claim because they're on the chain because they're distributed models. You don't want to store clinical data there. So you store pointers and hashes of the clinical data instead. And so the two things that I found very interesting about this paper. First off, the reward for participation was actually research-based. So researchers could potentially submit queries to the chain to say, okay, give me a count of the patients that are taking some medication, and then the rewards would be paid out as a bounty or a query bounty for that particular research organization. And it's actually in pilot. This is one of the cool things. This is one of the solutions that is out there in the field being used and tested by providers at Beth Israel. So at the end of our summary analysis, what we wanted to do was kind of take the objective data that we were collecting about these papers, the metadata, and try to categorize it and see if we could find some patterns along the way. And so one of the key things that we wanted to see, all right, what is the content that's actually stored on the chain? First off, the vast majority of papers said no actual patient data should be, or no clinical data, I should say, should be stored on the chain. It's distributed, you can't do that. You can use the chain for authorization data. I think that's a very good use case for distributed consent. And then record locator was another one. And then the participant domain was actually something that was also very interesting to us because of the spread that we saw across all the sub domains within healthcare and how we could use this in the various ways that healthcare is delivered in this country. Especially with research, we saw the incidence of clinical research coming up quite a bit in a lot of these papers. I thought that was very interesting. So moving ahead, out of Plug-a-thon, what did we find, and where do we see blockchain evolving? So this is one of my favorite graphics in the industry. It's the Gartner hype cycle, and you can find these, they're publicly available. You can find them for a lot of different technologies, pretty much every technology that's out there in just about every domain. There's quite a bit of breadth here. But this one in particular is around healthcare, and it's talking about blockchain moving from the peak of inflated expectation into the trough of disillusionment, which I think is kind of a hilarious term. But this is a very intuitive graphic. I mean, I think you guys can probably realize this yourselves that a couple of years ago, blockchain was the solution to all of our problems, and now we're seeing, okay, maybe it's not the solution to everything. And it's quickly moving into the trough of disillusionment, but we've got some solutions out there that are going to be able to get it out of that trough fairly quickly as well. So a couple of challenges ahead, right? There's some technology challenges to begin with. First off, you've got a distributed model here. How are you securing this information? How do you make sure that there's no PHI being distributed? And how do you protect it, right? There's just some very core challenges with that. And then there's a lot of business challenges as well. Who's going to fund this? How do you incent participants to donate their compute power to providing solutions that are blockchain-based? And then, something that if you guys have tried to make headway in healthcare, you'll come up against this a lot, is just business inertia. You've got organizations that have spent dozens of years investing in technology, and how do you convince them to start uprooting some of those investments and replace them for something that maybe hasn't been proven out in the field just yet? That's something that we're going to be hitting up against quite a bit. So end results, right? What did we come out of the Plug-a-thon learning? So we're not as skeptical anymore. So that's the good thing. We definitely understand that there's going to be a lot of challenges, but But we think that some key areas of focus, kind of common themes that we noticed both in the papers, but then in all of the conversations and education sessions at Plug-a-thon, were that distributed consent and authorization is a very big concept with blockchain, and I think that's going to be one of the areas where we find a lot of technology use. Record locator service, distributed record locator service. So John had mentioned earlier about smart alerts, right? This is something that I think we could really easily power with blockchain rather than having a single repository for, that patient locator information. Smart alerts can use the chain to figure out where the patient has been and be able to fire those alerts to the right providers. The other thing that was actually unique to what we learned within the Plug-a-thon itself was around alternative incentive models. So there's a company called Grapevine, which I thought had a very cool solution. So Grapevine was formed by a company named Tiani, who's participated heavily in the IHE Connect-a-thon as well as the Interoperability Showcase in the past. And so what they wanted to do was build a blockchain framework specific to healthcare. And their thought was that patients could be incented to share their information on the blockchain or via the blockchain by giving them what's called grapes. So the concept is a patient, allows access for their information to be used for research purposes or for quality purposes, that sort of stuff, and they'll get grapes in return. And these grapes can then be used to further other healthcare services. So let's say the patient wants a second opinion on a piece of data that they've been given, a diagnosis that they've been given, let's say. How do we use, they can use their grape to hand that grape to a secondary provider who now has automatic access to their information via via the blockchain, via Grapevine. So I thought that was a very interesting model. And I think we'll find the most success in emerging areas of the domain. So think about alternative payment models, ACOs, which haven't actually made a ton of investment just yet. They don't have that inertia around their technology investment, and so they're able to be more open to new technologies and innovations. So at the end of the session, we were very excited about some of the conversations that we were having. We started a Slack channel, and we're participating in the Slack channel ongoing to be able to continue the momentum from Plug-a-thon and start thinking about ways how we can really implement this in the real world. So with that, I'll turn it over back to John for questions.
Okay, so you heard now two different views to participation in the Plug-a-thon. Now, one of the takeaways we got is that the Ready Computing folks are in helping organizations develop tools and bring things into the market and working with some of the clients. Well, it turns out that the NJII folks are a great conduit to clients. I mean, that's their life. They live in that with practices and hospitals and data sources and data needers. So I think that's one of the things that when we look at the Plug-a-thon as an event, what we want to build are new partnerships, are new pilot opportunities. The conversations that were conducted at the Plug-a-thon are the kinds of things that the industry needs. Right, so Samir brought into the conversation at the Plug-a-thon information that they weren't somewhere else. Right, it was an ONC challenge. It was something that maybe other people that were in that event weren't aware of. And I think that's the most important thing with this new technology exploration, is to open it up to new input. Right? And that's where when we look at it, it's a little tough calling it a beginning of a testing continuum, but it is really about how do you take it from a thought, how do you take it from a potential challenge, which we've kind of labeled as use cases and things like that, into something that can be concretely developed and owned by stakeholders, both on the developing side but also on the using side, right? So I think that's one of the things that we found, and the Plug-a-thon event this year supported that. I mentioned earlier that this is kind of an ongoing thing. So the road to the progression of new technologies in health is something that will continue now. We have a Plug-a-thon event in Europe. So IHE Europe, this one was done with IHE USA, the deployment committee of IHE in the United States. And In Europe, there's one called IHE Europe, and they have a Connect-a-thon that they do. It's going to be in The Hague and Amsterdam this year, and there will be a Plug-a-thon there. And they are now in the process of fleshing out the tracks. Europe might be a little different in terms of its priorities and where they are, but they're also taking our results. They're also taking the input that we learned, both good and bad. I mean, what were our challenges? What did we have out there as objectives? What did we succeed on? What didn't we succeed on? How can they do that better? And I think that's what we really like to have with this Plug-a-thon idea, is that come in, bring your knowledge that you have, and either as a sponsor, and we offer the opportunity, like for these two organizations, to bring in people to participate, but also bring in your own organizations as sponsors to see this in the interest of the ecosystem improvement, right? And I really appreciate their taking the time and money. They put cycles and stuff on the table to help this cause. So really appreciate that, for them. And I think we heard that they liked it, and we're going to continue that with them. So at this point, I'd like to open the floor to questions. This is kind of new stuff, so we're kind of open to questions of all flavors. So if you've got something, we've got a couple of mic runners here on the left and right. So raise your hand, and they'll bring you a mic. Please feel free to be open with your thoughts.
Yeah, so great presentation, thanks. Samir, I think this is a question for you. You mentioned about the pilot for the clinical research blockchain project. Do you have any more information about that? And can you talk a little bit about that? I'm curious to understand how blockchain is starting to penetrate the market in actual real pilot settings.
Yeah. So the pilot's at Beth Israel. I'll admit that I don't know the status of it today, but it was started by John Halamka's team. So everyone here probably knows John Halamka, or at least by name. So I would actually be very curious as well in terms of, how much success it's found now that it's been out there for probably, a good couple of months at least. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. I just want to add to this, the presentation that was done here. Samir mentioned this organization called Grapevine. They are actually a company that's based, I think, in Austria. So when we looked at the IHE Europe opportunity, it's like, oh yeah, they're right in there. They're going to take it there as well. And I find the use of the metaphor of grapes and the grapevine. It's kind of like putting the health spin on the Bitcoin phenomena, right? So blockchain is the underpinning technology for Bitcoin. This is the healthy flavor of that. So you got to think about adding fruit and vegetables to our diet here, right? So any other questions?
Yeah, Tone, to your point, I'll just clarify also for Grapevine, they're going to be running a couple of clinical trials with test data in Austria. And then as a member of their advisory board, we're looking at some U.S. applications to do the same thing. We'd love to chat with you about your library of test patient data for doing some of these projects, with that idea of using both a private permissioned blockchain as an underpinning for some of the information exchange internal to the process, and then the grapes are built on an Ethereum model for using that broader incentivization as part of the ecosystem. But the key is how you define that new ecosystem for participants and incentivize new models for the business process.
Yeah, there's 2 points to there, right? One is blockchain just as a technology, just like any other technology. Maybe you're not going to find that organizations are advertising their use of blockchain quite as much. It's just they're just using it underneath the covers. You would never even know that it's blockchain. But then I think very much to Jim's point is you have a shift in thinking, a shift in the paradigm around what incentives really look like. So for patients, having grapes and receiving grapes and be able to use that for some other tangible benefit, I think is going to be interesting, but it's going to take a paradigm shift in that entire ecosystem to be able to accomplish that.
Yeah, a lot more to come in that, and I think as Samir said, you start off very skeptical. There's a lot of stuff that comes at us in healthcare that you really take very cautiously, and I think we're going to hope that this event kind of drives that conversation to a point of a value prop, right? So we have to get past, as noted in that hype cycle, to a value prop. I want to mention one other thing, and something that I didn't mention earlier about the Plug-a-thon and who participates. Specifically in that M-Health space, in the app world, and maybe the IoT space. One of the things we try to do is to have organizations that we'll call data sources, people that own data, not the products that they use, but the organizations that own the data themselves. The HIEs, the hospitals, these are people that have data. And what we wanted to do is to invite them in to be resources that these startup companies and these M-Health and IoT vendors could use. Now, we did a lot of outreach around that. I'd say we weren't quite as successful with that as we could. We did have John's organization bring in stuff, and they brought it in two flavors. They are a conduit to a data source. We had an HIE from Philadelphia bring in some data, that would be available. Most of them made it available via an API kind of interface. So I think that's something that they're going to try to leverage going forward as well. So in this early round of exploration, really try to reach those organizations that have some data. So if there's anyone in the audience that is in that kind of organization, so not a product company themselves, but the customers of those product companies, we're very interested in having you participate in the Plug-a-thon going forward, right? And I think what we also learned from the patient generator resource that John brought in, hey, this is an opportunity for us, not just in the Plug-a-thon, but hey, maybe the Connect-a-thon. Maybe in the conformity assessment stuff. We need better data, right? As our interoperability challenges become more difficult to evaluate before you get on site, having, I think, a really robust test data set that is really leverageable on behalf of those customers, those users of it, I think might be something we can help promote going forward. So. Another question, Tone, you had a question?
Yeah, just a quick question. And a comment to the patient data generator. I like the problem that solves. That's something I deal with all the time, right? I mean, I develop something and I push it out, and we get a lot of surprises in production data sets. So, yeah, and we end up pushing back because of those unknowns. My other question is about testing blockchain at the Plug-a-thon. Can one of you talk a little bit about what was their actual testing? Was it more testing concepts and ideas? Kind of where is that? With respect that, and this is a comment I think you made, John, it starts in these kind of Plug-a-thon lab-like environments, and then it expands out to interoperability testing, and it expands out to performance testing down the road. Mm-hmm. But can you talk a little bit about the testing aspect of blockchain specifically?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we found was nobody really had technology that was mature enough to test at Plug-a-thon. So Plug-a-thon itself was in test, right? This was the first time we did it. And so we were kind of trying to figure out how to derive the most value of it in real time. And so it became apparent that we could spend our time trying to develop a solution, but it wasn't going to happen in 3 days. So instead, what we wanted to do was focus more on the education and a lot of the conversations around where can we use this? Why is this a better solution to this problem than something else that we could use? And that's really what ended up happening at Plug-a-thon.
Yeah, I think just to add, John, did you have something?
No,
okay. I think just to add to that, I think that's a good term. The Plug-a-thon is in test because it really is. And what we saw that even the tracks that we did do, that for the blockchain track was more on that education node of that circle and discussion node of that circle. But as you go into the devices on fire track, for instance, that was a little more mature. They actually had a real use case. They had a lot of the device vendors there. They had solutions that used to be done with an older technology, and they're now bringing it to a newer technology, a newer standard. So there was actually coding and connecting trials done. So it really does depend on the technology and the topic of the track, and we kind of look at that circle as an opportunity depending on where that technology is in the industry. So I wasn't surprised. I think coming into it, we already had discussions at the webinars that said, hey, we don't have anything to really test here. We said, hey, that's okay. That's okay. Let's still stand this up. So.
And John's exactly right. The challenge we had with 2018 was it was new and it was kind of cutting edge, and there's lots of communications and education that can still take place. But within the blockchain community as such, you've got the Hyperledger project, you have the Ethereum Alliance, you have consortiums, Hashed Health, you have consortiums of groups who are spending time trying to figure out how to make the protocols and enterprise systems work. I'd like to see, taking the mantle of responsibility personally, to bring some of those folks in, the John Basses and the Brian Bellendorfs and such from those consortiums, so that their protocols, as they are maturing in industry activities, get tested against, an IHE profile or an HL7 Fire, either through Gazelle or through some other mechanism. And that's a goal to start for me to start working on, for us to start working on for 2019.
Okay, anyone else?
Tone, I guess the last part is, there were some proposals, I think Tiani put them on, about how you might take an XDS architecture and put blockchain in that. So that was the idea, as we said, it's from something that is, does this make sense, all the way to, well, what might that look like? Leading into profiling as the next activity. So that was a part of that whole mix.
Yeah, good point.
Okay, anybody else? Okay. Well, thank you all for coming here, and stay in the conversation. We are really in this developmental mode for these new techs. I think eventually what we're hoping is the things that we're doing here in the Plug-a-thon kind of event will work their way going forward into this interoperability showcase. And you're going to start to see scenarios that incorporate those technologies and the solutions around those technologies becoming part of care protocols and clinical scenarios and things like that. So we really need your input, and I thank you for your attendance and participation today, and enjoy the rest of your show.